One of the reasons why the U.S. elite who run the country and select our next leaders don't want to cede control to China is that we don't want the Chinese to change all the rules. If we allow for the Chinese controls because of a huge lease, and the Chinese want to lease us gold because we've reneged on all the past leases of Chinese gold. Very few people realize that in 1999, when the U.S. signed or granted most favored nation status to China as part of the release of Hong Kong into Chinese hands from the British, the most favored nation status actually had a huge provision in there where we leased Chinese gold. And in 2007, we told them, F you, we're not giving it back. That's when the Chinese partnership turned to trade war. They want to lease us the gold now so they can colonize us. And it's really sad, but it's the only way we're going to see a recovery in the United States.
Can you explain that to people, though? Because I vaguely understand. I can't say I understand it entirely, but what do you mean exactly when you're saying that the Chinese would be leasing us gold? I mean, let's break that down for people to understand that. I mean, I understand that there's because there's all these paper assets that are allegedly gold, but that's not what we're talking about, the exchange of paper or electronic assets. We're talking about something a little bit different here, aren't we?
We're talking about Fort Knox. Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton, and Papa Bush basically set the rules for gutting. I don't like to use the word stole, but I do sometimes. They did not steal the $500 billion worth of gold, roughly, in Fort Knox. They did not steal the 8,500 tons of gold in Fort Knox. What they did was they made leasing of the U.S. government-owned gold at 0%, and then made it a rule that only Wall Street banks could lease it. So they leased the gold, sold it into the market, made sure that the price went down so they could cover on their sales at a lower price and profit from shorting gold. Then they would put on futures contracts to short gold, and then they would also put on long contracts on the treasury bonds. So they sold the nation's gold by borrowing it at zero and invested in treasury bonds and called it the decade of prosperity during the Clinton years. The result is, Chuck, we don't have anything left in Fort Knox. I actually try to find out exactly what do we have in the way of gold in Fort Knox. I'm hearing we have a couple of barrels of gold coins that might be worth maybe $1 billion or two, but not the $500 billion in gold bars like what you saw in, say, Goldfinger. That was a fun movie, but it revealed a good point that if you make contaminated the gold and then it's not useful, then what happens to the U.S. nation? Okay, but let's not get sidetracked. The point is, the United States government does not have any gold reserves. So how do we make a legitimate currency that will compete against Russia's, that will compete against Chinese, legitimate gold-backed currency? How can we even compete against Mexico that is about to launch a silver-backed currency, peso? Oh, my God. So how does the United States come up with an official government-owned reserve hoard vault system full of gold to back our new dollar? We don't have. There are two options, really. You can say to Papa Bush and Rubin, we want you to put the gold back, and we'll even give you some concessions, like we won't hang you for theft and murder.
Right.
They could do that, and Bush and Rubin can still be lords over the nation, but they sold most of it, and it's actually kind of funny. The Voice, who's one of my main sources of information, He's an official gold trader and consultant. The voice told me 2 years ago, Jim, it's amazing. You're hearing all these stories about rehypothecation, which means selling a person's account or an entity's account of gold, selling it and replacing it with a certificate. We did that for Germany. We did that for the Dutch. We did it for the Austrians, in other words, Central Europe. We sold their gold and replaced it with a certificate. He said the Bush family has suffered severe losses to their stolen gold accounts that have been rehypothecated in the major vaults of the world. All right, so back to the problem. The U.S. can say to the elite, help us replenish our gold reserves so we can have a legitimate currency and not fall into the third world from having a bogus currency like Venezuela and suffering 200 and 300% import price inflation. Help us to avoid the third world, and we'll grant you some amnesty for your crimes, your war crimes across the world, like stealing the Libyan gold, like all these color revolutions where we kill civilians willy-nilly. Okay, the other alternative is don't get the gold for the U.S. reserves from the stolen sources and criminals like Wall Street and former government officials. Instead, borrow it from China. Because, okay, those who like to look at the official gold inventory statistics, official gold reserves, it's a laughable event for me. The Chinese supposedly have 1,400 tons of gold, and it's up from 400 from 5 or 6 years ago. Oh, really? Does that count the SAFE, State Administration Foreign Exchange Sovereign Wealth Fund for China? I don't think so. Does that count the private families? They've got 20 Rockefeller families over in China, by the way. You think they had 5,000 years of history without some wealthy families? I don't think so. So if you add up all the Chinese wealthy family gold, you get about 30,000 tons. Or is it really 150,000 tons? Okay? So they're willing to lease gold to the United States so they don't lose a trade partner, a customer for Chinese finished goods. And the U.S. is now wrestling with the decision. Do we lease Chinese gold? And the Chinese are smart. Since we didn't pay back the 1999 Most Favored Nation gold lease, they said to us, we'll lease you 10 or 15,000 tons of gold to back your new dollar, but we're not going to put you in charge of it on U.S. soil. We can make some elaborate contracts and store it in China or some other point in a hidden spot in the Asian Pacific Rim. So we're going to get a tough decision. Do the U.S. elite members who control our government, are they going to allow us to fall into the third world just so they can continue to control it? Huge question, Chuck.
That is a big question, because this is what I also wonder is who actually is going to have the power to make that decision, whether we bother to try and replenish our own stock somehow, or if we're going to lease it from the Chinese. I mean, who gets to make that call? You know, this gets very confusing to me because, you know, obviously most of the names that we know are not really the people that are in control, okay? So, I mean, who is actually going to come up with this calculus? And by the way, guys, we are into the last half hour here. So if you wanted to try and join into the conversation, I forgot to mention the phone number at the beginning of the first hour because I got lost in this conversation with Mr. Willie. But 218-339-8525 if you want to join in for the last little bit here. 218-339-8525. I have control of the board if you want to call in. But, I mean, who actually gets to make that call, Mr. Willie? I mean, who could actually get that deal done, if you know what I'm saying? Because it's laughable to me when I hear, you know, the Trumpster talk about what he's going to be able to do with the Chinese. Don't worry, I'm going to make it. It's all going to be beautiful. It's very gangster-esque the way he presents it. I love it. because it reminds me of the other guys that have, vowels at the ends of their name and the attitude with which they usually do business. But anyway, put that aside.
I don't wish to get into the Trump story. I'd much prefer to try to answer the question of who makes the decision.
Yeah, please.
I believe it's the same group of people who decided that Obama would be the next president. I knew Obama was going to be president in May of 2008. How did I know that? Because the press started to make very favorable articles and discussions and portrayals of Obama, who accomplished absolutely nothing in his career to that point. He had been given a lot of criticism for his attendance at the Reverend Wright, kind of a racist black church.
Right.
And suddenly, he was called presidential timber in the press. He was given a tour of the European nations where they could be introduced to him, and he hadn't accomplished a single blessed thing in his political career. I concluded and told my black website manager in May of 2008, get ready, Donna. We're going to have a black president inaugurated in 7 months. And I told her why. All right, so the same people who decide that Obama's going to be president in advance and cover the favorable press reporting, you've got to portray him in a way that dumbass Americans can say, oh, I like that guy. I'm going to vote for him. Okay, we're talking about the 90 IQs that populate our nation. There's something else that's in the voting process. They decide for Ben Bernanke to be central bank head. They decide Janet Yellen is going to be the bank head for the central bank. They decided that baby Bush would become president. They gave pressure to Ronald Reagan to have George H.W. Bush as his running mate after Reagan said, the last guy on earth I will make my VP running mate is George Bush. They threatened to kill him. Okay, the people who own the Federal Reserve, I believe, are much the same people who own the Wall Street banks, who much are the same people who are minions to Jacob Rothschild. So who makes the decision? Rothschild and his gang. And just look up owners of the Federal Reserve, and you'll see a list of 8 or 10 families. It's kind of bankers' equivalent of the black nobility of the Vatican.
Yep.
Those are the ones who make the decisions, Chuck.
No, that's exactly right. That's